Right, so Russia admits shooting down a civilian jet, while back in Washington they're debating these nuclear-capable missiles for Ukraine. It really shows how easily, weak foreign policy and maybe political self-interest can drive some really dangerous global conflict. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, our source material, it's really focused on global instability and how it seems driven more by, well, cynical political calculation rather than actual strategic planning. It's October 9th, 2025, and the immediate news hook. It's shocking, but honestly, completely familiar, coming out of Moscow. President Putin finally admitted today, just today, that Russia's air defenses, they were responsible for downing that Azerbaijani Airlines jet. The AZAL crash, remember, back in December 2024, killed 38 people.
Yeah, and that admission, it took months. It's almost textbook, isn't it, this kind of conditional accountability? Putin didn't exactly express remorse. No, he framed it as a, quote, technical malfunction.
Yeah.
That happened while they were supposedly targeting a Ukrainian drone. What's interesting here, maybe unique, is that the admission only came out when it served a clear diplomatic purpose.
Easing those rapidly escalating tensions with Azerbaijan. It's such a contrast, this sort of self-serving, delayed confession, compared to Russia's usual playbook,
right,
which is like decades of just absolute denial. We saw that with MH17, for example.
Right. And that contrast, well, it sets our mission for this deep dive, doesn't it? We're trying to cut through the propaganda from Moscow, yes, but also Kiev and Washington to understand how this Russian pattern of denial, combined with the instability, and let's be honest, the political self-interest we see in NATO's response is actually increasing the risk of a much bigger conflict. We need to focus just on the facts, from our sources.
Okay, so let's unpack Russia's accountability playbook, it sounds like. Well, industrial-scale information warfare. When we look back at MH17 in 2014, that civilian airliner shot down by Russian-backed forces.
Yeah.
What was the denial mechanism then?
Well, the mechanism was immediate, very sophisticated, and totally absolute. The second it was clear it was a civilian jet, the narrative control just kicked in. Our sources detail this staggering output. Russia's state-funded troll farm. They posted 111,486 tweets.
Wow.
In just 3 days.
3 days? That's nearly 37,000 tweets a day. I mean, the number itself is nuts, but it's the sheer scale, the deliberate deceit.
Exactly. It's about creating immediate narrative chaos, confusion. They rapidly switched storylines, constantly pointing the finger at Ukraine. And look, it worked to some extent. A poll back in 2014 showed something like 80% of Russians surveyed actually believe the Ukrainian military caused the crash.
80%.
And institutionally, the resistance was total. Russia vetoed that UN Security Council resolution in 2015, the one seeking an international tribunal. They just blocked justice at every single level.
Okay, and now, let's fast forward to this recent AZL incident. You had Azerbaijan authorities openly saying Moscow was trying to hush up the incident for months. Accountability only surfaces when it's diplomatically useful, and even then, it's framed as what? A maintenance error.
A technical malfunction.
Yep.
Not a systemic failure of command, no. The common thread, really, regardless of the specific disaster, is that disinformation is the default setting. Any accountability is delayed, it's conditional, and it's only deployed if it eases some specific diplomatic pressure point. The whole structure of the Russian state seems geared entirely towards narrative control, not transparency. And that inherently creates global instability.
But look, the problems aren't just confined to Moscow, are they? We need to turn that same critical lens towards Kyiv, Ukraine's actions. Okay, understandably driven by this existential need for survival. But that's led to its own pattern of, frankly, dangerous denial and some pretty risky escalation strategies.
The Polish missile incident is a really clear example of this. You had the international investigation strongly suggesting the missile that hit Poland, the fatal one, was likely a misfired Ukrainian air defense weapon. But President Zelensky, he immediately and very forcefully denied it, demanded access to the site, blamed Russia entirely.
So what was the thinking behind that immediate denial, especially with the evidence pointing the other way?
Well, according to the sources, the core motivation seems political. Twofold, really. First, avoid handing Russia what he called a huge propaganda win. And second, maybe simultaneously, push the narrative that Russia was actively attacking NATO territory. Some sources suggest Ukrainian political actors are actively motivated to, quote, drag NATO into the conflict.
Drag NATO in.
Yeah, to save them, shorten the war. You see it in the repeated requests for no-fly zones or even, talk of preemptive strikes on Russian military sites.
But that denial, it seems it was really counterproductive within allied nations, didn't it? Our sources mention it generated mounting frustration in Poland, fueling so-called Ukrainophobes.
Precisely.
The denial basically gave ammunition to domestic groups in Poland, people already opposed to the aid. They could argue, look, if Kyiv can't even be truthful about a defensive accident, why should we keep footing this huge bill? It really highlights the risk, doesn't it? Relying on allies whose primary motivation, survival through escalation, might override transparency or even strategic stability. And we probably shouldn't forget the context here either. Ukraine, before the invasion, faced pretty serious concerns about being one of the most corrupt nations in the region.
Right. That was a sticking point for NATO membership talks before.
Exactly. So that history complicates the level of sort of automatic trust external partners can place in their public statements now, especially when things get desperate.
Okay, that dynamic, it takes us straight to the core problem of NATO strategy, I think. This issue of European dependency and then the instability coming out of U.S. policy. I mean, despite warnings going back decades, Eisenhower, 1951. You still have 600 million Europeans basically expecting 340 million Americans to handle their defense against Russia.
And this reliance, it's becoming structurally quite dangerous because Europe is so internally focused right now. You know, established ruling parties all across the continent, they're suffering. Lots of burgeoning social strife, as the sources put it, mostly driven by domestic economic stuff, migration issues. So you see populist far-right parties gaining ground, Germany, France, Britain. Given all that internal turmoil, the source material suggests that significant, consistent defense spending increases, which is really the only path to self-reliance for Europe.
It's just not likely.
It's unlikely to happen anytime soon, yeah.
So they failed to prepare adequately, and now that vulnerability is just magnified by inconsistency coming from Washington. That sort of mercurial nature of U.S. foreign policy, especially under someone like Trump, must be catastrophic for alliance stability.
Well, yeah, deterrence depends on absolute certainty, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So when Trump was asked if he'd greenlight NATO countries shooting down Russian aircraft, he said, yes, I do. Straight up. But then, like, the very next question is, okay, would the U.S. back them up? And his answer depends on the circumstance. Depends on the circumstance. That's not reassuring.
It's catastrophic ambiguity. Allies just cannot rely solely on a U.S. commitment if the response is discretionary. If it depends.
And we've seen concrete examples of this uncertainty already, right? Like the U.S. pulling funding for that military support project for the Baltic states, the really vulnerable ones.
Exactly. That forces the most exposed allies to start hedging their bets. They have to. And look, we also have to note this alarming appeasement tendency that seems pretty entrenched now within parts of the Republican Party. Take Representative Ryan Zink, for example. He basically dismissed the seriousness of the AZAL plane crash and then suggested that, negotiations with Putin, they should start with concessions.
Concessions like what?
Specifically, offering Ukraine's neutrality no NATO membership and ceding Crimea, which he called Russia's only warm water port. He framed that as a good start. The good start. Wow. The sources frame that as politically expedient, right? Aiming for a quick foreign policy win. But offering up Crimea in 2025, what does that signal to every nervous NATO border state? Estonia, Latvia, Poland?
It signals instability, a lack of reliable commitment, full stop. It shows there's a powerful faction ready to trade long-term strategic stability for maybe a short-term politically easy exit from the conflict. And this really gets to the heart of the problem. Foreign policy choices are increasingly being dictated by domestic political math.
Which brings us neatly to our final section, because fixing dangerous global instability, it's clearly not the top priority for everyone. What are U.S. politicians focusing on instead of, say, unifying the alliance or creating coherent policy?
Well, we see some pretty clear partisan moves that seem designed to prioritize domestic financial interests, perhaps over the basic functioning of government itself. A key example, the Republican effort to deliberately gut funding for the Internal Revenue Service, slashing $20 billion. It fits perfectly with their stated plan to weaken the agency's ability to regulate and, crucially, to audit.
And the specific effects of that?
Yeah.
They're measurable, aren't they? These aren't abstract cuts. They directly impact the IRS's ability to audit, say, big corporations or the very wealthy, people using complex tax avoidance structures. The sources estimate these cuts will specifically mean, what, 400 fewer major business audits?
And about 1,200 fewer audits of wealthy individuals.
Annually.
Annually.
Right.
Look, it's a pretty cynical move when you break it down. It translates directly into real-world consequences, but mostly for the average taxpayer. By weakening enforcement on the wealthy and corporations, you essentially guarantee, as the sources put it, windfalls for the wealthy and powerful. Meanwhile, the burden of any revenue loss, or potentially funding future foreign policy needs, it falls back onto the less politically connected. It's a classic domestic political leverage play.
And this kind of domestic prioritization, it helps explain some of the foreign policy grandstanding we talked about earlier, doesn't it? These outrageous declarations, annexing Greenland, seizing the Panama Canal. Domestically, they're seen as attempts to maybe boost an ego, shape a legacy, or more likely distract from huge internal problems back home. Things like, planned mass deportations, tariffs that could wreck the economy.
Distract from that, absolutely. And the global confusion, the instability created by this inconsistent domestically driven policy, it's just treated as acceptable collateral damage. The pursuit of short-term political advantage at home, whether it's rewarding donors by gutting the IRS or creating a foreign policy spectacle, that pursuit is actively creating global unpredictability.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize the key knowledge you, the listener, now have. We've seen Russia relying on basically massive disinformation campaigns and accountability only when it's convenient. We've seen Ukraine, driven by survival, pursuing escalation strategies that carry their own risks, and critically, NATO's overall vulnerability seems compounded by this European dependency mixed with a U.S. foreign policy that's just erratic, increasingly driven by domestic politics.
Yeah, and this toxic mix, denial, escalation, strategic ambiguity. It means conflict management isn't really about global stability right now. It feels more like it's being handled for short-term political leverage. In Moscow, in Kyiv, and yes, in Washington too, that inability to commit or sometimes even just to speak truthfully about events, it raises the global temperature while simultaneously undermining the very cohesion needed to deter real aggression.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. If the West's primary motivation continues to be this kind of political grandstanding, whether it's making empty threats against adversaries or using foreign crises to distract from domestic issues, like deliberately weakening tax enforcement back home, what real incentive do our dependent allies have to actually become self-reliant? Why would they? And maybe more importantly, what price will ordinary Americans eventually pay when our foreign policy seems less about global leadership and more about domestic favors, and maybe only succeeds in lighting the match for a war we seem strategically and politically pretty ill-prepared to fight? Something to think about as you watch this instability continue to unfold.